The hum of the airport was a steady undertone, like waves lapping against a distant shore. Jordan Ellis adjusted the strap of his leather carry-on as he approached Gate 17. His travel routine was well rehearsed. Arrive early, avoid eye contact, and slip through unnoticed. It wasn't that he feared attention, but years of travel had taught him that being black and successful often drew the kind of notice he didn't care for: raised eyebrows, polite but curious questions, and the occasional outright suspicion. Today, Jordan's destination was Seattle, where he would present at a conference for emerging tech entrepreneurs. The flight, a premium transcontinental service, was one he'd booked weeks ago, choosing a first-class seat to work in comfort. Yet, as he approached the boarding queue, a sense of unease threaded its way into his otherwise calm demeanor. The airline staff was friendly enough, smiling and scanning boarding passes with efficiency, but it was the way their eyes lingered just a second too long on his, as though searching for something, that stirred a familiar awareness. A white-haired man in a crisp navy suit had passed through moments earlier without so much as a glance. Jordan stepped forward, handing over his pass, and waited for the faint beep of approval. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Ellis," the agent said, the words warm but mechanical. He nodded politely and moved on, finding himself in the jet bridge, where passengers clustered in small knots, adjusting bags and shuffling forward. Jordan took his place in line, feeling the weight of casual stares fleeting, harmless to some, but heavy to him. He imagined what they saw: a tall, broad-shouldered black man in his mid-40s, dressed in an understated gray blazer and pressed slacks. Professional, yet not quite what they expected. He had stopped trying to guess why long ago. As he entered the cabin, the cool air greeted him. The first-class seats were spacious, their cream leather cushions a soft invitation. He quickly located his seat, 3A, by the window. Sliding into place, Jordan exhaled and reached for his laptop bag, stowing it beneath the seat in front of him. The routine was reassuring, predictable. "Would you like champagne or sparkling water before takeoff?" The voice startled him. Jordan looked up to see a flight attendant, her smile practiced and pleasant. But her eyes held something else. Claire Madison, her name tag read, blonde, mid-30s, with the kind of polished appearance that suggested she had worked in premium service for years. "Sparkling water, please," Jordan said. She nodded curtly and moved on, though her tone was noticeably different when she addressed the older white man in 3B. The change was subtle, an extra ounce of warmth, a lighter cadence in her voice. It wasn't new to Jordan, nor was it something he'd expected to change anytime soon. Still, he leaned back, closing his eyes briefly, willing himself to focus on the presentation slides waiting for him instead of the nagging feeling he couldn't quite shake. The cabin filled with soft murmurs as other passengers settled in. A man in the row ahead was discussing real estate investments with his seatmate, while a couple behind him flipped through a glossy in-flight magazine. The atmosphere was calm, even serene. Yet, beneath it all, Jordan felt a dissonance, a faint, unspoken tension that he had grown used to navigating. When Claire returned, Jordan's sparkling water was conspicuously absent. She placed a flute of champagne in 3B's hand with a warm smile, then pivoted toward the next row, her tray now empty. Jordan raised a brow but said nothing. It was a small oversight, nothing to cause a scene over. He had learned long ago to choose his battles. But the omission lingered in his mind, not for its inconvenience but for what it suggested: a quiet affirmation of what he already knew. In spaces like these, his presence was still, at times, unexpected. The plane's engines roared to life, signaling the start of their journey. As they taxied to the runway, Jordan looked out the window, watching the world outside blur into motion. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, and the flight attendant's voice came over the intercom with the usual pre-flight instructions. Her tone was pleasant, measured, but Jordan found himself tuning her out. Instead, he focused on the rhythmic cadence of the engine, grounding himself in its steadiness. There would be time enough to address the omissions later, if they continued. For now, he simply watched as the plane lifted off, the city below shrinking into a patchwork quilt of light and shadow. It was a view he had seen many times before, and yet, like the interactions that colored his experience. It always felt just a little different from the way others seemed to experience it. The soft chime of the seatbelt sign turning off was the signal for movement to ripple through the cabin. Passengers unbuckled their belts, stretching slightly in their seats. As the flight attendants prepared to begin service, Jordan Ellis adjusted his laptop screen, the glow casting a subtle light across his face as he scrolled through his presentation slides. He paused, his finger hovering over the trackpad, and glanced down the aisle. The flight attendant carts had emerged, gliding smoothly as Claire Madison and her colleagues maneuvered between rows with practiced ease. She carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Jordan watched as she moved from passenger to passenger, her voice low and cordial. A smile here, a laugh there, small gestures that made the experience feel personal at least. For some, as the cart reached the first-class cabin, the hum of conversation softened. Trays were unfolded, drinks poured. Claire stopped at 3B, leaning slightly as she offered the man a choice of entrees. He chuckled at something she said. Their exchange easy, unhurried. The smell of roasted chicken and herbs wafted through the air, mingling with the faint tang of freshly poured wine. Jordan closed his laptop and sat back, waiting his turn. When Claire turned to him, her demeanor shifted, though only slightly. Her smile was polite but thin. Her words clipped. Would you care for the chicken or the pasta, Mr. Ellis? She asked, her voice carrying none of the warmth she had shown just moments ago. The chicken, please, Jordan replied, his tone neutral. Claire nodded and moved on. Jordan waited, his hands resting lightly on the armrests. He glanced out the window, the faint outline of clouds blending with the dimming light. The quiet anticipation of a meal felt familiar, an expected rhythm of air travel. Minutes passed. A soft clinking of cutlery and glasses began to fill the cabin as meals were distributed. Passengers leaned over their trays, unwrapping small packages of butter and peeling back the foil lids of their entrees. Jordan shifted slightly in his seat, his table still empty. He looked down the aisle and saw Claire speaking with another passenger. Her tray now empty. Perhaps she forgot, he thought. It was possible after all. Mistakes happen. He pressed the call button discreetly, the faint ding barely noticeable over the low hum of conversation. It was a small request, nothing worth drawing attention to. When Claire approached, there was a flicker of hesitation in her expression. Yes, Mr. Ellis? She asked, her voice measured. I believe I may have been missed during the meal service, Jordan said evenly. His tone was calm, devoid of accusation. Claire's brows knitted together briefly, then smoothed. Oh, I'll check on that, she said quickly, almost dismissively. Before turning away, Jordan watched her retreat, feeling the faintest prickle of something he couldn't quite name. Annoyance? Disappointment? No, it was subtler than that. It was a quiet confirmation, a reminder of the kind of oversight that felt far too intentional to be a simple mistake. Still, he said nothing, choosing instead to sit back and wait. The wait stretched on. The sounds of utensils scraping against plates began to fade as passengers finished their meals. Claire returned to clear trays, her movements brisk and efficient. But when she passed Jordan, her eyes flickered to his empty table and then away, as if she hadn't noticed or didn't want to. Jordan took a slow breath, steadying himself. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. It wasn't even the worst. And yet, the weight of it still settled uncomfortably on his chest. It wasn't about the food. He knew that. It was about the smallness of the moment. The way it reduced him, made him invisible in a space where he had every right to be seen. Excuse me. A voice broke the quiet tension. Jordan turned to see the woman across the aisle, a middle-aged passenger with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes. Her name, he later learned, was Emily Turner. Would you like part of mine? She asked, gesturing to her tray. I'm not very hungry, and they gave me plenty. Her offer was genuine, her tone laced with quiet concern. Jordan smiled faintly, shaking his head. Thank you, but I'm fine, he said. Emily hesitated, then nodded, her gaze lingering a moment longer before she returned to her meal. As the flight continued, Jordan remained silent, his thoughts drifting. The incident had been small, almost imperceptible to anyone who hadn't been paying attention, and yet, it carried the weight of a larger truth one he had long grown accustomed to shouldering. The world didn't change in a single moment. He reminded himself. It shifted slowly, like the currents below the clouds, shaping the landscape over time. For now, all he could do was wait and watch. His appetite gone but his resolve quietly intact. The cabin had settled into a rhythm, the gentle hum of the engines underscoring the low murmur of conversation. Outside the window, the vast expanse of sky seemed endless, a serene backdrop to the quiet drama unfolding within. Jordan Ellis remained in his seat, composed but alert. His empty tray table stood as a silent marker of the unspoken slight that had gone unnoticed or unacknowledged by most. Across the aisle, Emily Turner stole a glance in his direction. Her eyes held a mixture of curiosity and unease, as though she couldn't quite decide whether to intervene further. Jordan caught her gaze and offered a polite nod, a subtle reassurance that he was, at least outwardly, unbothered. But beneath the surface, his thoughts churned. Why had Claire Madison overlooked him? Was it truly an accident? Or something more insidious? He replayed the interactions in his mind. The clipped tone of her voice. The way her eyes had skimmed past him as though he were barely there. It wasn't the first time he had encountered this kind of quiet dismissal. But familiarity didn't make it any less disheartening. The flight attendant reappeared, her polished demeanor intact as she moved through the cabin, offering coffee and dessert. When she reached his row, Jordan sat up slightly, preparing to speak, but Claire bypassed him once again, her tray angled toward 3B, where the white-haired man beside him accepted a cup of coffee with a smile. Jordan pressed the call button, his action deliberate but measured. The soft ding drew Claire's attention, and she turned toward him with a faint flicker of irritation that she quickly masked with a professional smile. "Yes, Mr. Ellis," she said, her tone even. "I'd like a coffee, please," he said, his voice calm but firm. Claire hesitated, her expression unreadable. "Of course," she replied, then moved to retrieve the drink. When she returned, she set the cup down without meeting his eyes. "Thank you," Jordan said, though his words felt hollow. He sipped the coffee slowly, the bitter warmth grounding him as he considered his next move. Speaking up further would risk drawing attention, potentially escalating the situation into something messy and public. But staying silent felt like an acceptance of the slight tacit agreement that this was something he should endure quietly. The tension in his thoughts was broken by Emily, who leaned slightly across the aisle. "Is everything all right?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with concern. Jordan looked at her, surprised by the question but grateful for her acknowledgement. "I'm fine," he said, offering a small smile. "Just a little oversight, I suppose." Emily frowned, her eyes narrowing as she glanced toward the galley where Claire had disappeared. "It doesn't seem like just an oversight," she said, her tone cautious but firm. "I've been watching. She hasn't treated you the same as everyone else." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implications. Jordan appreciated her candor, but he felt the weight of what it meant to agree with her. Admitting it aloud would make it real, something that couldn't be brushed aside or ignored. "It happens," Jordan said finally, his voice quiet. "More often than you'd think." Emily's frown deepened, but she didn't press further. Instead, she nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the truth in his words. A few rows ahead, another passenger turned in his seat. James Carter, a man in his 60s with a weathered face and a salt and pepper beard, had been listening. He spoke up, his voice low but steady. "I noticed it too," he said. "That's not how first-class service is supposed to go." His statement drew a ripple of attention from nearby passengers. Heads turned subtly, eyes darting toward Jordan and then back to their own trays, unsure whether to involve themselves or remain spectators. The discomfort was palpable, an invisible thread weaving its way through the cabin. Jordan shifted in his seat, aware of the growing scrutiny. He hadn't intended to create a scene, but now it seemed unavoidable. Taking a deep breath, he addressed James. "I appreciate that," he said, his tone measured, "but I'm not looking to cause trouble." "It's not about causing trouble," James replied. "It's about being treated with respect." The words settled heavily in the air, resonating with an unspoken truth that many seemed reluctant to acknowledge. Claire re-emerged from the galley, her gaze flickering briefly toward the cluster of passengers now watching her movements more closely. She hesitated, then continued her service, her steps more deliberate, her demeanor more guarded. Jordan leaned back in his seat, letting the conversation around him fade into the background. He wasn't sure what would come of this moment, if anything at all. But for now, he resolved to hold steady, to let the quiet strength of his presence speak louder than any words he might say. The engines droned on, the plane cutting through the clouds with steady precision. It was a rhythm that felt oddly comforting, a reminder that, even in turbulence, forward motion was inevitable. The cabin had grown quieter as the flight progressed, a kind of calm descending over the passengers. Trays had been cleared, and most travelers were now engrossed in their own distractions, books, movies, or the endless scrolling of their phones. But for Jordan Ellis, the stillness only amplified the unresolved tension that lingered in the air. He glanced out the window at the vast expanse of clouds, their serene, unchanging presence a stark contrast to the discomfort simmering within him. The incident with the flight attendant was small by some measures, a forgotten meal, a delayed cup of coffee, but it was also more than that. It was a reminder, subtle yet sharp, of the ways he could be made to feel invisible in spaces he had every right to occupy. A voice broke through his thoughts. "Excuse me, miss?" It was Emily Turner, the woman across the aisle, her tone polite but firm. Claire Madison appeared from the galley, her professional smile slightly strained. "Yes. How can I help you?" "I couldn't help but notice," Emily began, her gaze unwavering, "that Mr. Ellis here seems to have been overlooked during the meal service. Twice. In fact." Claire blinked, her composure faltering for a brief moment. "Oh, I'm terribly sorry if there was an oversight," she said quickly, her words practiced but hollow. "We do our best to ensure all passengers are served promptly." "I'm sure you do," Emily replied, her voice calm but edged with a quiet insistence. "But it seems odd that such an oversight would happen to the same person more than once. Don't you think?" A few passengers turned their heads, their curiosity piqued. The low hum of the engines filled the brief silence as Claire hesitated, searching for a response. "I assure you, it wasn't intentional," she said finally, her voice a shade defensive. "We value all our passengers." "Words are easy," James Carter chimed in from a few rows ahead. He turned in his seat, his expression serious but not unkind. "Actions tell the real story." Jordan shifted in his seat, his discomfort growing. He hadn't asked for this. And yet the support from Emily and James was undeniable. They were giving voice to something he had long grown accustomed to letting pass. Still, the attention felt like a spotlight he hadn't sought, and he wasn't sure whether to embrace it or deflect it. "I appreciate everyone's concern," Jordan said finally, his voice steady but quiet. "It's not worth making a scene over." "It's not a scene," Emily replied, her tone softening. "It's about making sure things like this don't keep happening." Claire's posture stiffened, but before she could respond, another passenger spoke up, a younger man seated a few rows back. "I saw it too," he said, his voice tentative but clear. "He was skipped during the meal service. And the drink service too. It's not right." The murmurs began to spread, subtle at first, but growing as more passengers exchanged glances and whispered observations. Jordan felt the weight of their attention pressing down on him, a mix of sympathy, curiosity, and perhaps a touch of discomfort at seeing the unspoken so plainly laid bare. Claire's smile had vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped expression. She nodded curtly. "I'll speak with the purser," she said, turning sharply and disappearing into the galley. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted, the tension palpable. Jordan leaned back in his seat, his gaze fixed on the seat back in front of him. He could feel Emily watching him, her concern genuine but unspoken. "Thank you," he said quietly, turning to her. "I mean it, but you didn't have to do that." Emily offered a small smile. "Maybe not," she said, "but sometimes it takes someone speaking up to make a difference." Jordan nodded, his expression thoughtful. He wasn't sure what difference, if any, this moment would make, but for the first time in a long while, He felt less alone in the quiet battles he fought, battles that often went unnoticed by those around him. A few minutes later, the purser, Linda Rodriguez, approached. Her demeanor was calm, her professionalism evident in the way she addressed Jordan directly. "Mr. Ellis, I understand there was an issue with your service," she said. "I want to personally apologize on behalf of the crew. We'll ensure this doesn't happen again." Jordan studied her face, searching for sincerity. He saw no malice, no overt dismissal, but the apology felt rehearsed. A formality rather than a genuine acknowledgement of the underlying issue. "Thank you," he said simply, choosing his words carefully. "I appreciate you addressing it." Linda nodded and withdrew, her steps brisk as she returned to the galley. The cabin settled once more, the hum of the engines filling the silence. Jordan returned his gaze to the window, the clouds still drifting endlessly below. Emily leaned slightly toward him. "Do you think they'll really make any changes?" she asked. Jordan considered the question, his expression unreadable. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he said finally, "but maybe this is a start." The quiet wisdom of his words seemed to linger in the air, resonating with Emily and perhaps even with others who had witnessed the exchange. For now, the plane pressed on through the sky, its path steady, its passengers left to ponder the subtle but profound weight of what had just unfolded. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight entered its cruising altitude. The murmur of voices had subsided, replaced by the rustle of newspapers and the soft tapping of keyboards. Jordan Ellis sat still in his seat, his coffee now cold on the tray table before him. The tension from earlier lingered like a faint echo, a quiet reminder of what had unfolded. He gazed out the window, the vast sky stretching endlessly, its calmness a stark contrast to the turbulence of his thoughts. The purser's apology had been polite, her tone carefully measured, but it hadn't erased the weight of the experience. Apologies, he had learned, often addressed the surface but rarely touched the roots. "Mr. Ellis." The voice startled him slightly. He turned to see James Carter, the older man who had spoken up earlier, standing in the aisle beside him. "Mind if I sit for a moment?" James asked, gesturing to the empty seat next to Jordan. Jordan nodded, gesturing for him to sit. James lowered himself into the seat with the ease of someone accustomed to navigating life's complexities. His presence was steady, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about what happened earlier," James began, his voice low and deliberate. "I've seen things like that before, more times than I can count. And every time, it sticks with me." Jordan regarded him quietly, his own thoughts unspoken. James continued, his gaze fixed on the seat back in front of him. "The thing is, it's not just about the coffee or the meal. It's about what it means. Being overlooked, dismissed. It tells you something, even if they don't say it outright." Jordan nodded slowly. "It's the small things that pile up," he said, "the ones people tell you to ignore because they're not big enough to matter." James turned to him, his expression earnest. "But they do matter," he said firmly. "Every time someone stays silent, it tells them it's okay to keep doing it. And the cycle continues." Jordan leaned back in his seat, considering the man's words. He had spent much of his life choosing silence out of caution, out of exhaustion, out of the need to protect his own peace. But James's perspective was hard to dismiss. Silence, too, carried weight. Across the aisle, Emily Turner was watching them, her expression a mix of curiosity and quiet support. When Jordan's gaze met hers, she gave him a small nod, as if to say she was still on his side. The sound of footsteps drew their attention. Claire Madison approached, her demeanor more subdued than before. She stopped at their row, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Mr. Ellis," she began, her voice quieter than before, "I wanted to personally apologize for earlier. It wasn't my intention to make you feel overlooked." Her words were careful, measured. Jordan studied her face, searching for something beyond the surface. Was she sincere, or was this just another scripted gesture to smooth things over? "I appreciate the apology," Jordan said after a pause. His tone was calm but firm. "But it's not just about intention. It's about impact." Claire blinked, his words catching her off guard. "I understand," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. "I'll do better." Jordan nodded, letting the conversation end there. He wasn't interested in dragging the moment out, but he hoped his response would linger with her, planting a seed of reflection. As Claire walked away, James leaned back in his seat, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You handled that well," he said. "It's not about handling it," Jordan replied. "It's about being clear about what's acceptable and what's not." James chuckled softly. "That's handling it, son. And it's something not everyone knows how to do." The two men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared understanding filling the space between them. It wasn't a loud or dramatic moment, but it carried its own kind of power, a quiet defiance against the small injustices that so often went unchecked. As James returned to his seat, Emily leaned slightly across the aisle. "You're making an impact," she said softly, "even if it doesn't feel like it right now." Jordan offered her a faint smile. He wasn't sure if she was right, but her words carried a certain hopefulness that he found himself wanting to believe. The engines droned on, steady and unchanging, as the plane cut through the clouds. Jordan settled back into his seat, his gaze returning to the window. Change, he knew, was a slow process like erosion shaping the landscape over time. But moments like this, as small as they seemed, were part of that process. For now, he resolved to hold his ground, to let his quiet insistence speak for itself. The journey was far from over, but it had begun, and that, he thought, was something. The cabin seemed quieter now, the hum of the engines a steady backdrop to the muted activities of the passengers. Some dozed in their seats, their faces softened by sleep, while others leafed through magazines or tapped idly on their screens. Jordan Ellis sat still, his hands folded loosely in his lap, his thoughts far from the orderly rows of the plane. The apology from the purser, the stiff interaction with Claire Madison, the support from passengers like Emily and James, all of it swirled in his mind. A quiet storm of emotions that he tried to sift through. He wasn't angry, not exactly. It was something subtler, a familiar heaviness that came from years of walking a path where every step was shadowed by the question, "Do they see me? Do they see all of me?" The sound of approaching footsteps brought him back to the present. It was Linda Rodriguez, the purser. Her expression was calm but focused as she stopped beside his row. "Mr. Ellis," she began, her voice low and professional. "I wanted to follow up with you personally. I've spoken to the crew, and I want to assure you that we're taking your concerns seriously." Jordan looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "I appreciate that," he said simply. Linda hesitated, as though weighing her next words. "If there's anything else we can do to make your flight more comfortable, please don't hesitate to let me know." Her offer hung in the air, polite but distant. Jordan could sense the boundaries she had drawn, the careful line between acknowledgement and action. He nodded, letting the conversation end. Linda gave a small, professional smile before retreating to the galley. Across the aisle, Emily Turner glanced over, her expression a mixture of curiosity and quiet encouragement. "What did she say?" she asked softly. "Nothing I haven't heard before," Jordan replied, his voice steady. Emily frowned slightly. "It feels like they're just trying to move past it without really addressing what happened." Jordan gave a small shrug. "That's usually how it goes," he said. "People like to fix what's on the surface without digging too deep." The conversation might have ended there, but a voice from behind them broke the quiet. "That's the problem, isn't it?" Jordan turned to see James Carter standing again, his hands resting on the back of his seat. His expression was calm but resolute. "Nobody wants to talk about what's really going on. They just want it to go away." James's words seemed to ripple through the cabin, drawing the attention of a few nearby passengers. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, while others listened intently. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was heavy, laden with the weight of unspoken truths. "I think most people don't know what to say," Emily offered, her voice thoughtful. "Or they're afraid of saying the wrong thing." "That's part of it," James agreed. "But sometimes staying silent does more harm than saying the wrong thing. At least talking about it starts the conversation." Jordan leaned back in his seat, watching the exchange. He appreciated their willingness to speak up, even as he wrestled with his own reluctance to engage further. He had spent so many years navigating these moments quietly, choosing his battles with care. Was it worth pushing here? Now, in this confined space? As if sensing his hesitation, Emily turned to him. What do you think, Mr. Ellis? She asked, her tone gentle but probing. Jordan took a breath, letting the question settle before answering. I think change starts with small moments, he said finally. Conversations like this, people noticing what they didn't see before. His words were quiet, but they carried a certain gravity, drawing nods from both Emily and James. A few other passengers, who had been listening silently, exchanged glances, as though weighing the truth of what he had said. Linda returned to the cabin, her presence prompting a shift in the atmosphere. She glanced at Jordan, then at the passengers now engaged in quiet conversation. Her expression guarded. It was clear she had noticed the ripple effect, though she said nothing. As the plane cruised on, the tension in the air began to dissipate, replaced by something more reflective. The conversations continued, subdued but meaningful, as passengers shared their thoughts in low voices. Jordan remained quiet, content to let others take the lead for now. He could see the beginnings of something in their words: awareness. Perhaps. Or even understanding. It wasn't a dramatic resolution. There were no grand gestures. No sweeping changes in policy or attitude. But it was something, a moment of shared acknowledgement that felt rare and significant. And in the stillness that followed, Jordan allowed himself a faint smile, the weight on his shoulders just a little lighter. The clouds outside shifted, catching the golden light of the setting sun. It was a small thing, but it felt symbolic. Change, however slow, was still possible. The flight's rhythm was unbroken, a seamless journey through the clouds. Yet beneath the quiet hum of the engines, something had shifted. Conversations that would have remained buried in the politeness of silence had surfaced, drawing attention to a moment that might otherwise have been forgotten. For Jordan Ellis, this change was both comforting and unsettling. It was rare to see such open acknowledgement. Yet he couldn't help but wonder how far it would go. The purser, Linda Rodriguez, approached his row once again, her expression a blend of determination and unease. She stood with her hands folded, her professional demeanor softened just slightly. Mr. Ellis, may I have a word with you? She asked quietly. Jordan nodded, setting aside the book he had been leafing through. Linda gestured toward the galley, where they could speak without the curious eyes of other passengers. He followed, the muted clatter of glasses and trays filling the narrow space. Once there, Linda took a deep breath, as though steadying herself. First, I want to thank you for your patience, she began. Her tone was low but sincere. I've spoken with the crew, including Ms. Madison, and we've reviewed what happened. I want to assure you that this will be documented and addressed. Jordan tilted his head slightly, considering her words. Documented, he repeated, the word landing softly but carrying weight. What does that actually mean? Linda hesitated, clearly aware of the layers in his question. It means that the airline takes situations like this seriously. We'll review this incident as part of our commitment to improving service and ensuring that all passengers are treated fairly. Her response was measured, precise, a careful alignment of corporate language and personal accountability. But Jordan wasn't sure it was enough. I appreciate the effort, he said, his tone calm but firm. But it's hard not to feel like this is just another box to check. An apology, a promise to do better, and then we move on. Linda met his gaze, her expression thoughtful. I can't change what happened, she said, but I can make sure it's part of a larger conversation within our team. Change takes time, but it starts with moments like this. Jordan nodded slowly. Her honesty was something he hadn't expected. And while it didn't erase the sting of the incident, it offered a glimmer of hope. I suppose that's all I can ask for, he said finally. As he returned to his seat, he noticed the way the atmosphere in the cabin had subtly shifted. Emily Turner offered him a small smile, a silent affirmation of her support. James Carter gave him a nod, the gesture understated but meaningful. Even a few passengers who had remained silent now seemed to carry a different energy and awareness they hadn't had before. Claire Madison appeared a few minutes later, moving down the aisle with a tray of drinks. When she reached Jordan's row, she paused, her expression hesitant. Mr. Ellis, she said softly, I'd like to offer you a drink on the house. My way of saying I'm sorry. Her voice was quieter than before, lacking the crispness of her earlier tone. Jordan studied her for a moment, seeing the subtle tension in her posture, the way she held herself, as though bracing for rejection. Thank you, he said simply, accepting the offer with a small nod. Claire set the drink down gently, then lingered for a moment. I've been thinking about what happened, she said, her words halting but genuine. It wasn't fair, and I'll do better. I just wanted to say that. Jordan regarded her carefully. The apology felt different this time, not rehearsed or obligatory, but something that came from within. I appreciate that, he said finally. It's a start. As she moved on, Jordan allowed himself a small sigh. It wasn't resolution, not entirely, but it was something, a sign that even the smallest moments could leave a mark. The rest of the flight passed quietly. Jordan found himself reflecting on the day's events, the way the incident had unfolded and the responses it had drawn. It wasn't the first time he had experienced something like this, but it was one of the rare times it had been met with such open acknowledgement. Perhaps that was progress, or perhaps it was just an anomaly. Either way, it was a moment he wouldn't forget. As the plane began its descent, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their approach. The golden light of the setting sun bathed the cabin, casting long shadows that stretched across the rows. Jordan looked out the window, the sprawling city below coming into focus. Emily leaned across the aisle one last time. You've handled this with more grace than most, she said quietly. Jordan gave her a faint smile. You don't get much choice in how you're treated, he said, but you do get a choice in how you respond. Her eyes softened, and she nodded. Still, it means something. As the wheels touched down and the plane taxied to the gate, Jordan felt a quiet resolve settle over him. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot, but perhaps, in its own way, it had just begun. The plane eased to a stop at the gate, the hum of the engines fading into silence. Passengers stirred, reaching for bags and stretching limbs stiffened by hours of flight. Jordan Ellis remained seated, his gaze fixed out the window. The city lights twinkled against the deepening dusk, each one a pinprick of life, of stories unfolding beyond his own. The usual shuffle of disembarkation began, with passengers filing into the aisle, their expressions a mix of relief and anticipation. Jordan watched them for a moment before rising, retrieving his carry-on with practiced ease. He felt the weight of the day, not just the physical exhaustion, but the emotional toll of navigating yet another moment where he had been both seen and unseen. Safe travels, Mr. Ellis, Linda Rodriguez said as he approached the front of the plane. Her voice was calm, but her expression carried a sincerity that hadn't been there earlier. Thank you, Jordan replied, offering a polite nod. As he stepped onto the jet bridge, the cool air brushing against his face, he felt a strange sense of relief. The ordeal was over, but its echoes remained, faint and persistent. Behind him, he could hear Emily and James exchanging quiet words, their voices carrying a note of determination. It was clear that the incident had sparked something in them, a small but significant shift in perspective. Blank. Blank. In the terminal, the world felt both vast and impersonal. Travelers hurried past, their faces a blur of intent and distraction. Jordan moved through the crowd with the same quiet composure he had carried on the plane, his thoughts a steady current beneath the surface. As he reached the exit, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his screen lighting up with a message from Emily. Thank you for your grace today. It meant something not just to me, but to everyone who was paying attention. Let's keep the conversation going. Jordan read the words twice, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He typed a brief reply. It's a start. Safe travels. Blank. Blank. The drive to his hotel was uneventful, the city unfolding in a series of blurred lights and quiet streets. When he arrived, he settled into the small but comfortable room, setting his bag down with a sigh of relief. He sat by the window, the view offering a glimpse of the bustling city below. He thought of Claire Madison, of her faltering apology and the way her eyes had lingered just a moment too long, as if searching for something in his response. He thought of Linda Rodriguez, her carefully chosen words, and the weight they carried. And he thought of Emily and James. Two strangers who had chosen to speak up in a moment when it might have been easier to stay silent. Jordan reached for his laptop, opening it with a sense of purpose. He began drafting an email to the airline, recounting the events of the day not with anger, but with clarity. He described the moments that had stung, the responses that had soothed, and the quiet hope he carried that these experiences could lead to something better. The words came easily, a reflection of years spent navigating these moments with quiet resilience. When he finished, he reread the email, his finger hovering over the send button. He hesitated briefly, then clicked it, the message disappearing into the ether. Blank. Blank. The next morning, as the city came alive outside his window, Jordan's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a reply from the airline. The message was formal but thoughtful, acknowledging the incident and assuring him that it would be addressed at both a team and organizational level. They thanked him for his feedback and for his patience, promising to follow up with specific steps they planned to take. Jordan set the phone down, feeling a small flicker of satisfaction. It wasn't a resolution, not entirely, but it was something, a ripple in the water. Blank. As he prepared for his day, Jordan reflected on the journey, the moments of discomfort, of quiet confrontation, of unexpected connection. All of it had left its mark. Not just on him but on those around him. Change, he knew, was slow and often invisible, but it began in moments like these. A word spoken, a silence broken, a story told. He stepped outside, the morning air crisp and full of possibility. The world moved on, as it always did, but Jordan carried with him the quiet strength of knowing that even the smallest actions could matter. And with each step forward, he felt a little lighter, a little more certain that, in time, the ripples would grow.